people can make decisions that in the short term maximize profits and bonuses, but are bad decisions for the long term. I mean, there are decisions that can maximize short-term profits, but people would also agree that they might not be the best long-term interests of a company. Isn't that right?
If you're referring to this gentleman...
No, I'm just referring as a general proposition. You would agree that there are times when you can maximize short-term profits, but if you looked at over the longer term, people would agree that it was not a good long-term decision. You would agree that there's some decisions that fall into that category.
Certainly not by design, but in retrospect, clearly.
Okay.
Sometimes that happens.
Let me ask you with respect to clawbacks, and I'm not talking about anything with respect to Lehman Brothers, but just as a proposition. Wouldn't you agree that it's appropriate that if somebody makes a decision that raises short-term profits and therefore bonuses, but then it's later shown that those same decisions resulted in harm to the company, that on behalf of the shareholders, and certainly in cases where the public is now involved, that the shareholders or the public should be able to go back in and get a clawback and take those bonuses or additional payments back that are proven with the benefit of hindsight to have been bad decisions for a company and the shareholders?
That was actually one of the things I spoke about when I said interesting way to go forward is a long-dated compensation system. In our case, that's exactly what we had. We had a long-dated compensation system. Look, I am not proud of the fact that I lost that much money. But it does show that the system, our compensation system, did work. I left 10 million shares plus a whole number of options. I say I'm not proud of that. But when the firm did not do well, I was probably the single largest individual shareholder. I don't expect you to feel sorry for me. I don't mean that. That's not my point. My point, though, is that the system worked.
Let me, Mr. Chairman, if I could. I mean, you're now referring to shares that you owned, which obviously when the company went bankrupt went down. I'm also referring to bonus payments that may have been made in previous years to executives, including yourself, when now that the company has gone bankrupt, wouldn't it make sense to have provisions to protect shareholders, not just to, clearly when the shares go down, the value of the company goes down, the share value, but wouldn't it make sense to have clawback provisions with respect to bonus payments, cash payments, so that the shareholders could recover those monies that were bonuses for what clearly proved to be bad decisions?
If you could answer that briefly, Mr. Folt, then we'll move on.
I'm sorry,
If
sir.
you want to answer that briefly, you may, but we have to move on.
Our compensation system was specifically set up, even for me, in 2007. 85% of my compensation was in stock. I lost that. All stock that I got for the last 5 years, I lost that. Actually, compensation that I received back from 1997, 8, and 9, I went to the Compensation Committee and said, I believe we should extend the vesting on this. I could have gotten it 7 years ago. I went to the Compensation Committee and said, this should be extended to a 10-year vest. I lost all of that. I'd like also for this committee to know that before the end of our second quarter, I went to my board and I said, I think we're going to have a tough quarter. We were talking about how we were going to pay the troops, as I called it. I said, I want you to take me out of it. I believe, given this performance, my recommendation to you is that I do not get a bonus. I'd like this committee also to know I got no severance. I got no golden parachute. I had no contract. I never asked for a contract. I never sold my shares. That's why I had 10 million, because I believed in this company. I believed that this company, and that's why I said, I'm glad I got these last 2 quarters behind us. I believe we're on the right track. I could have sold that stock. I did not, because I firmly believed that we were going to return back to profitability and get back on the road.
Thank you, Mr. Fuld. Thank you, Ms. Van Hollen.
Thank you.
Mr. Sarbanes, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that you believe.
A global leader in insurance and asset management. Allianz, financial solutions from A to Z. A global leader in insurance and asset management. Allianz, financial solutions from A to Z.
On this hour of the show, about Heidi cooking. Sydney and Heidi.
Looks like it's going to be somewhat a victim.
I mean, you did some business with them, so you knew how they operated.
We did some business
You
with
then said earlier that at the time you bought them, you changed management, changed underwriting standards, and took other actions designed to pull back on the very risky nature of the way they were conducting business, which I respect, although there's some evidence that the practice has continued nonetheless. And I guess that's an admission by Lehman that the standards that were being used up to that point, in other words, by those companies when you were doing business with them but had not yet bought into them, were not adequate standards. Now, one of your vice presidents, this was mentioned briefly, went to California to kick the tires on First Alliance and came back with a memo saying these sorts of things. First Alliance is a financial sweatshop specializing in high-pressure sales for people who are in a weak state. And let me just mention, my primary concern with all of this, and Lehman's an example, it's not the only example, it's an example, is that what was happening was the thirst for more originated loans upon which you could build an empire of derivatives and slice and dice up the chain to make more money. The thirst for those got pushed down the chain and encouraged people to look the other way in terms of standard conventional underwriting standards and so forth, which then created a culture and atmosphere in which predatory lending could flourish. And I think that's what ended up happening to the detriment of millions of homeowners across this country. So sweatshop was one description. He said First Alliance was the, quote, used car salesman of blemished credit lending. They made loans where the borrower had no real capacity for repayment. And at First Alliance, it is a requirement to leave your ethics at the door. And in spite of this, Lehman went ahead, invested in the company, and there's other evidence. I may run out of time because I want you to respond to this. There's other evidence that these sorts of practices and ethics continued even after First Alliance was purchased or you took some kind of ownership stake in First Alliance. How could you consort with this kind of an operation given how lax those standards were?
I'm not sure if we took an equity stake in First Alliance, but that doesn't answer your question at all. We actually spent some time with First Alliance. I believe that was in the mid-90s, and I think in the late 90s we extended financing to them. And we worked with them to change underwriting standards. In the case of the ones that we bought after, BNC and Aurora, we acted more as a conduit. That means we went to them and bought their production and their production of mortgages. And in that, we began to understand their business practice. Our name became associated with them.
You've been listening to the hearings of the House Oversight Committee. You're listening to Chairman of Lehman Brothers, Richard Fuld. Also, one of the investors who bought put options in Lehman was Bill Ackman of Pershing Square Capital Management. Bloomberg's Margaret Popper is with Bill Ackman at the Value Investor Congress. Let's find out what he's got to say. Margaret?
Hi, yeah, here I am talking to Bill Ackman, and obviously he's a voice that in the current market environment people really want to hear from, and we want to start with Wachovia because you own about 107 million shares?
170 million.
170 million shares of Wachovia at this point. So as you're looking at those shares, and you're thinking about what the company's worth, what's your value range for Wachovia?
Well, it depends on what happens. Obviously, if Wells Fargo buys the company under their current deal, it's worth 0.1991 or 20% of where a Wells Fargo share trades. If a Citi deal happens along the lines that was described, what I talked about at the presentation is that the holding company that's left is quite an interesting company. It owns Wachovia Securities, it owns A.G. Edwards, has some very interesting tax attributes, NOLs, the ability to carry back losses and recover some tax payments. We think there's a fair amount of cash left at the holding company. There you can get to actually some bigger numbers. So interestingly, if the Citi deal were to have gotten done, we think the holding company might sell for a value meaningfully higher than the Wells Fargo bid. So
would your expectation be, it sounds like you're saying there's more value in a breakup than keeping it together. Is that, you'd rather see that than the Wells Fargo bid that keeps it together? I think it depends on what the alternatives are, and we're happy to be a Wells Fargo shareholder. I mean, Wells Fargo is a very well-run institution if they're the high bidder. But we think what the value created when the businesses are separated comes from the fact that some tax attributes are created. There's some losses that happen in the event that the bank subsidiaries. It's a very unusual transaction. What's happening? Your presentation said that could be about $27 billion. The companies will lose about $21 billion plus around $6 billion of losses that have been taken already, and those losses can be used